So let's get started then. Hello, my name is Dr. Rama Al-Mahdi. Some people know me as Red. Welcome to this joint event between LSE and Imperial College London's staff networks, our LGBTQ+, and BAME staff networks. The event's entitled From Stonewall to Black Lives Matter, Examining the Impact of Protests. I'll be chairing this today alongside my co-chair, Dr. Donald Palmer, who I think is here somewhere.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello and introduce himself.
Can you hear me, Red?
I can, yeah.
Brilliant.
So do you want to just introduce yourself briefly, Donald? Or?
All right, yes, yeah, I can introduce myself. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone that's present here today. And again, you know, for Imperial College London and LSE for organizing this event. My name's Dr. Donald Palmer. I'm an associate professor at the Royal Veterinary College, University of London, and I'm really excited to be here this afternoon. I'm going to pass you on to my co-chair, Red. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Right, so as Donald said, we're both very excited about being invited to co-chair this event because I think for both of us, protest has meant quite a lot for us personally and certainly in our careers. And I think there's a long history of protest in Black and LGBTQ+ liberation struggles. And I think Donald, Dr. Palmer knows well, because he experienced this himself at the tender age of 19. It was the first time he sort of got involved in a protest when he joined the 1981 Black People's Day of Action after the New Cross house fire, which killed 13 young Black people, and there was absolutely no police investigation undertaken at all. So Donald attended that incredible expression of grief and anger and action, along with 20,000 other people in London that day, and chanted along the slogan of 13 dead and nothing said. A major tabloid newspaper the following day ran the headline of "The Day the Blacks Ran Riot." And I think that's quite funny because, like with the BLM protests today, protests are often become or are later characterized as riots. And the first Pride protest in 1969, which is thought to have happened at Stonewall Bar, which was at the time a safe haven for LGBTQ people to come together, was a riot. It was started by Marsha P. Johnson, a queer Black person who, after being physically assaulted by the police, threw the first punch in defense of the constantly harassed individuals who attended that bar. So the history of protest for both Black and LGBTQ liberation efforts is also one that's quite well woven, and it's quite difficult to unpick, despite the fact that we sort of hear very clear narratives of the two as separate today. And that made me start thinking when I was asked to chair to this event, and I was sort of compelled to revisit some of the work of Audrey Lorde, who, as many of you know, is a Black American poet and activist and essayist, and she really dedicated her life to battling racism, sexism, and homophobia. And there's one essay in particular which she wrote, which talks about her experiences protesting during the 1960 civil rights movement. And she wrote it later in her life. And that essay is called I Am Your Sister, Black Women Organizing Across Sexualities. And it really struck me how pertinent her words are to actually exactly what we're talking about today. So I'm just going to share a small sort of abridged excerpt here. I have heard it said that Black lesbians have not been and are not involved in the struggles of Black people. But I was a Black lesbian when I helped fight for the Black Studies department of my college. When my girlfriends and I drove through the Mississippi Delta in Jackson in 1968 with a group of Black students from Tougaloo, and another car full of redneck kids trying to bump us off the road all the way into town. We were Black lesbians. When I weaned my daughter so I could go to Washington to work in the coffee tents in the 1963 March on Washington, I was a Black lesbian. When I picketed for welfare mothers' rights and against the enforced sterilization of Black girls, when I fought institutionalized racism in the New York City schools, I was a Black lesbian. But you did not know it because we did not identify ourselves. So now you can say that Black lesbians and gay men have nothing to do with the struggles of the Black nation. And that essay was published in 1988. That was the year I was born. So I think, just to paraphrase a famous Spanish philosopher, the importance of those experiences and that history is, if we don't tell our actual brutal oppressive histories through the lens of those oppressed voices, then we're pretty much doomed to repeat those histories. And there's certainly a great deal to be said for considering that in how we protest. So I'm going to hand over to Donald to take us a little bit further into the future somewhat, as a contemporary take on his thoughts of protest.
Well, thank you, Red. You really set the scene wonderfully. And I've only got a few sentences to add. And it's really come full circle. And you're right in that, in terms of the gay liberation struggle and the Black struggle are really indeed interconnected. And what we forget sometimes, and there's a brilliant piece by Jonathan Borge called The Queer Black History of Rioting. And I think it's particularly pertinent when we talk about Black history. And he writes that the history has been written to disqualify and erase the efforts of those on the front line, the Black queer community, Black transgender women in particular. And as we now come full circle and we talk about Black Lives Matter, perhaps it's forgotten that two of the original people that are involved in setting up these organizations have actually commented and qualified themselves and identified themselves as being queer. And indeed, when we look at the murder of George Floyd, but not only George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor and others that have sparked this unprecedented wave of what I could say international activism. It is really a case of trying to generate reform and accountability. And we've seen across the globe series of protests that have taken place, and really to draw attention to the struggles and discrimination that Black people face worldwide. And indeed, there's really the connection between gay pride and the Black Lives Matter movement. And discussing this with Red, I remember she told me of a situation where she's currently staying in Copenhagen, where in fact, what's been happening over time, particularly in some aspect of the pride movement, is that it's become more corporate. And many of the struggles, which really were originated in the 60s and the 70s by a large number of as they call themselves, Black queers, have been lost. And what's quite interesting, that in the recent Pride event in Copenhagen, she told me, leading that parade was a person of color to actually reclaim the struggle and the identity. And I leave finally with, again, because of Black History Month, again, this brilliant blog, and I'm hoping the organizers can put this blog on the chat, because I really think it's quite important, that highlights, and as we want to, Black History Month, celebrate some of the notable people that have been involved in this struggle, such as Elaine Noble, Harvey Milk, and others that have really made important contribution. And then again, it's people of color. We forget, for example, Bayard Rustin, who was a key advisor to Martin Luther King. We've mentioned Audrey Lorde and others, and indeed James Baldwin. And perhaps, some of you may have seen the show last night that was on BBC4, I'm Not Your Negro, and he talked about America in terms of about being morally monstrous. And I think these discussions and what's needed to take place is really key. So I'm really delighted to have 3 speakers with us today that are real leaders in this area. We've got Christopher Joel De Shields. I hope you can all see the slide. He's Director of Community Engagement and Pride in London. We've got Chloe Davies, who's the Head of PR and Partnership of MyGwork, the Global Recruitment Network Hub for Lesbian, Bi, Trans and Gay Professional, and Dr. Ish Kanyan. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. She's Associate Professor in Social Policy at LSU and also the Executive Director of Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equality Program. So we are really delighted to have these 3 speakers with us. If I'm rightly remember, in terms of the order, I think each speaker is going to have 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a series of questions. And if people would like to put their questions, am I right? This is going to be the questions they can pose are in the chat. If one of the organizers can tell me if I'm correct in that.
There's a Q&A box as well.
Yes, there's a Q&A box. Yeah. So really, we're hoping people can put their questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. But if so, don't worry, we'll try and get there. And we aim to finish by 5. But if there are 1 or 2 questions left, we're told that the speakers will stay for just a little bit. But we want to be professional and keep to time. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, which is Christopher. Christopher, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald, and good afternoon to everyone that's listening and joining us today, and to my fellow panelists. I'm Christopher Joel De Shields, the Director of Community Engagement for Pride in London, and also the Executive Director of a newly formed organization called Black Trans Alliance. I'm delighted to share this space today as we talk about protests and activism. For me personally, I really didn't get involved in day-to-day activism until I joined Pride in London back in 2016 in the role as Director of Community Engagement. So behind the glitter, the music, the entertainment, the floats, the parades, there's a great deal of campaigning that goes on as an organization, which in turn pulls you in to becoming your own activist in your own right, which I have become. So whether or not this is campaigning for issues on the Gender Recognition Act, campaigning for our LGBT siblings in Poland, lifting the voice of the wider trans community, particularly those that are Black and brown. There are a lot of issues that we work on and campaign on, and each year we have a theme. And we recognize as an event organizer that Pride remains a protest, and we consider ourselves as activists rather than event planners. So for me, the journey into activism is really not about raising a flag and going. It's about raising a flag, going, and understanding the cause that you're supporting. So for me, I've had to reflect back on the rise of the modern LGBT movement. Marsha P. Johnson, that's already been mentioned, Sylvia Rivera, Miss Major, all key figures in the beginning of that movement and the Stonewall riots. 3 Black and brown trans women who led the way. I've also had to reflect on the civil rights movement and the role that they played, and particularly looking at Bayard Rustin and how he participated as a gay Black man in making that movement come to life, and some of the work that he's done. But I can also fast forward to 2013 and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was founded by 3 Black women, 2 of them who identify as being part of the LGBT community. So that's Patrisse Cullors and Azera. So they really have paved the way for, I guess, as leaders in a movement. And for me, as a Black gay man, standing and working in a space that's often deemed as white, I really had to understand the roots and some of the work that they had done in the beginning to really help the movement, and the created footprints to follow. Therefore, for me to really center myself in the movement, I've had to understand and really want to uplift the voice of those marginalized communities that sit within the LGBT community. So it's not just a community, there's communities within the community. It's about being able to effectively support our trans siblings. It's also, for me, looking at grassroots organizations, excuse me, and the role that they actually they play in really forming the foundations for protest and activism, because they really bring their causes to the forefront. And I felt using my role and using a platform as large as Pride is very beneficial. But it's also, being able to input to a strategy that really defines Pride as a continued movement. Many people tend to think that Pride is simply just an event for celebration. And in some aspects, it is very celebratory, because we celebrate, from where we're at in the beginning of the movement to where we come today. But for myself, in my role, I will always see it as a protest. It's also the opportunity to use the platform to educate people, to empower people, and to understand the causes that we're supporting. And I think, we're here today to converse and really learn about activism and protest. And I'm hoping that from the conversations that we have today, from listening to the panelists that are joining me, listening to the host, that you yourselves will be able to pick up the mantle and fight for social change and equality that we want to see in society. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. I would like to ask questions now, but I realize we'll have to wait. Really, there's some useful points. So we come to our next speaker, Chloe. Chloe, I did see you earlier. So
hi, I am here.
Brilliant.
I'm here. Thank you. No, it's nice to be here with you all. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to being to this panel. Nice to see a familiar face. It's really good. I think Chris is the first time we've been on a panel together. So yeah, Chris and I go back a little ways. So my name is Chloe Davies. I'm head of PR and partnerships for MyGwork. We are the online business community for LGBT students, graduates, business professionals, and all those who believe in true workplace equality. I've been in a role now for about 18 months, but I've come from the community. So as you can see, I'm definitely a Black woman. I am bisexual, cisgender. I'm a mother of 2. I've got 2 little boys, Miles and Theo, and I class myself as a mental health survivor. So very much all of those identities carry with me in my every waking day. Outside of my day job, I volunteer for UK Black Pride and the London Queer Fashion Show. So I'm really kind of trying to do that community engagement work alongside everything else that I do. And in thinking about this panel and kind of when we're having these conversations as panelists and kind of in the planning, and the idea around protests, first and foremost, before we get onto the streets, before we actually march, our very beings, especially as Black and brown bodies, Black LGBTQ people especially, and like Chris mentioned, you know, just before in his speech, when we look at, you know, trans lives, Black trans women in particular, our very beings are political. You know, we can see for the last few months as the world's ignited under the Black Lives Matter movement, even more so, just how insignificantly in some instances Black bodies actually are cared for. So the very starting place of protesting for me is being myself, of actually navigating through work, navigating through life, being present, being in spaces that might not traditionally have been designed for me, but also being able to show up alongside my community. That's very much my protest. And how do I bring that into my job? How do I bring that into the work that I do? So I facilitate our internal and external voices through our employee engagement and training. We've got a lot of different avenues, and earlier this year we were able to have an online work Pride, I should say, put my teeth back in, a Work Pride conference, which was 185 speakers from around the world, facilitating many different conversations, 5 days, 5 themes, which reached over 20,000 people on the actual week, and the numbers have continued to rise. How do we facilitate those conversations that are so important, they're so necessary in terms of how we see each other, how do we thrive, how do we, you know, come together, how do we disrupt the status quo and then rebuild that benefits for all of us, but also remembering at the heart of everything that the more marginalized you are, the more assistance, more help, more work is needed, but also the more insight into actually your very lived experience and your existence. And so that has become my passion, I guess, if you want to call it that. I just think that I'm using my voice. I was, funny enough, I was on a panel not too long ago. I think I was talking about this at Out and Equal, and we were talking about what does it mean to be an activist. And in really understanding what it means to be an activist, I'm very uncomfortable with the term and title activist. I am not an activist, although I am acting. I think I'd like to class myself as more of an advocate, in that I am using my voice to help facilitate, especially those more marginalized than myself, in the spaces that I have access to, and the privilege that I do. So I'm really thinking about what work is so necessary. I kind of had a whole speech when I really thought about what I wanted to bring here, but I wanted it to come back to that circle around protesting. So my mum is Nigerian, my dad is half Sierra Leone, half American, but you can all see what's going on in Nigeria at the moment. And as I know we're going to talk about this, we talked about Black Lives Matter, we talked about, you know, the disproportionate amount of Black trans women in particular who are passing away. It was over 331 last year, and it's 33 and rising so far this year that are just Black trans women. You know, they're numbers that should cease to exist. And then we saw, after, you know, 10 days of you know, peaceful protesting in Nigeria, peaceful protesting, just what has happened when people come together, stand together to raise their voice, to try and make a positive change for who they are and their existence. Because at other times, that's the only starting place that we have, which is to be loud when we feel that the establishments aren't looking at us in any other way. And unfortunately, we have seen the loss of life that has come from that, you know, at Leckie's Tollgate Bridge yesterday. So I think in anything, it's really understanding the nuance around, but the heart of why we have to protest in the first place, and understanding the different lived experiences, because my experience is going to be very different to Chris's experience. Yes, we're both Black people, but how we identify will have a different impact on how we come into the conversation. And in the same, you know, as an academic, I hope that's the right title, but you know, for you, I mean, it will also be different, even if we do speak on behalf of our communities or for others. Our actual viewpoint of protesting will be very, very different. You know, being being associated with volunteering as I do for a Pride organization, the way that we protest in comparison to other Pride organizations again will be very, very different. We are, a grassroots organization that is led by people, for the people, by our community, and so how we will do that will be very, very different, and you'll see that alongside so many different organizations. But we have to still keep that point of protesting is ultimately about people and people raising their voice for a viewpoint, and that we don't really all understand people enough to understand why people need to protest. So as we come into today's discussion and we look at what the impacts of protesting is and how we may measure that and recognize that, we have to keep in mind that it means so many different things for so many different people, and that's the starting place of actually how do we really make that fundamental change? Because if we don't know why people are protesting simply because maybe we're not listening, how do we really actually make fundamental change for the future? So I think that was good. 8 minutes. And I'll stop there.
Chloe, no, thank you very much. That's truly inspirational. And I like the way you really articulated the diversity of protests. And no doubt that we can explore some of the some questions that have come in through the chat. And I know we've already received some questions earlier in the week, so we're going to discuss that. So if I can bring in our final speaker, Dr. Amana, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Ish Kanyan, who's Associate Professor in Social Policy at LSE, and Executive Director of Atlantic Fellows of Social and Economic Equity Program. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thanks, okay. Donald.
Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me to speak to you all and to be part of this really important panel discussion. Before I start my remarks, I just want to say that the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Program, which I have the privilege to lead, is very much committed about working to create collective leadership, values-led collective leadership, to create a fairer, healthier, more inclusive societies. And we welcome activists, practitioners, academics to join us from across the globe to be part of this community of practice. What I'd like to cover is a few things. First is why people protest, in my opinion. Then I want to talk a little bit about inequalities within movements and a power dynamic, and to focus on intersectionality. Then I want to talk about success in movements and end with something a little bit more constructive about the sector that I work in, which is academia, about what we can do as academics in order to perhaps change the way things are and create a better world. So in terms of why people protest, it's obvious to me in some sense that it's because their voices are not being heard, their issues are not being addressed. I'm an Armenian, and in my country where I was born, but I didn't grow up, there's a war happening right now. So in the streets across Europe and the United States, Armenians are taking to the streets to protest. And this is not, because they want to do this, it's because their voices are not being heard. And we've seen this with Black Lives Matter. We saw this with the LGBT movement. When people feel that their rights, their voices, their concerns are being ignored by those in power, the common practice is to take to the streets in order to garner that attention. But what makes protests successful is more complicated, and I'll come to that because I think we also need to problematize the concept of success. Success is not a train that you sit on from point A and then get off at point B and you've arrived at your destination. To be a successful movement, you constantly have to think about where you want to be and what are the forces that might be working against you. So there are always counter protests and counter movements to the movements that emerge for rights and for progressive causes. But before I turn to that, I think, given that this is a collaborative panel of the LGBTIQ societies at LSE and Imperial, and LSE Embrace and the BAME and Black Lives, those who are working on Black issues, I want to kind of talk about intersectionality here. We assume that, movements are all sometimes unified, working for similar issues and causes. But what I found through my research is that movements themselves are spaces of power and spaces of inequality. Not everyone's voice within even a movement, a protest group, matches the same. And I think this is an issue that we have to look at head on. How do we practice? How do we live those values that we want to see in the world? This is really important. For instance, in the anti-austerity movement in the UK, which I studied, there was a lot of people involved, but relatively very few Black people, very few people of ethnic minority origin. And this was a puzzle for me. Why are people not protesting when austerity is affecting them so deeply? And there are issues, around, for instance, people not having the time, some communities not having the migration status, so not wanting to be visible in the public spaces, and also because feeling marginalized within those spaces of protest. So I think it's always something for, organizers of protests, of movements, to be cognizant that there are different kinds of identities that may make people feel less included, and to be aware of those inequalities within their own spaces, whether that's around race, ethnicity, gender, or in fact, class, because sometimes movements can be, for the rights of the working class, for the poor, but sometimes middle class people might be leading those movements. So it's very important to keep all of those things in mind and to have a radical democratic practice that takes into account these different positionalities. I think here I want to draw on Nancy Fraser's work, in the sense that she talks about movements are often talking about representation, recognition, and redistribution. But how do we achieve that? And I think that's something to bear in mind. How do we achieve representation and recognition in order to get redistribution that some movements are fighting for? So focusing on power in movement is really important, and not just power outside of movement. In terms of thinking around success, I think it's really important to think between the short term and the long term. You might achieve short-term success, but that doesn't guarantee long-term impact. And I think oftentimes when we look at what leads to success, there are a few things. Number one, there's clear and actionable goals. Slogans sometimes work, in terms of being able to rally people. But beyond that, I think it's important about having an ability to put your point across, to be able to change the conversation. Now, that does not happen overnight. Even the Black Lives Matter movement did not happen overnight. We all know this. So how do you change the conversation? How do you get to that point where people are thinking differently? What was once unacceptable becomes acceptable. And I think here we need to think about the norms that are changing, the conversations that are changing, and alongside that, the policies that need to change. And I think this takes time, this takes commitment, and it takes building alliances with other movements and other actors. It takes finding inroads into institutions of power, which will have the ability to make those changes, and to think about how you're going to keep doing that when we all know that taking part in movements and protests is very exhausting. And sometimes, we don't recognize the emotional labor that involves. And I think, to reference Audrey Lorde's work, self-care is political. You also have to look after yourself. And there's a huge amount of literature now emerging on emotions and social movements, the recognition that it takes a toll on people who are involved. So those are just some thoughts around success. And I would also add another area of work that I've done research on is violence against women. And while, of course, if we take a long-term view from the 1970s to today, yes, there have been great achievements. We now have more refuges for women, more support services. But we also know that when the coalition government came to power in this country in 2010, they began to chip away at those refuges, particularly the refuges that were serving minority communities of ethnic ethnic groups. So I think we cannot, as I said, think of, okay, we've achieved this and we can rest now. That's not how it works. Moreover, in other countries across the globe, from Hungary to Russia, we have anti-violence against women movements that are saying, oh, well, domestic violence is part of our culture. We shouldn't be, too bothered about it. So I think those are two things that I would say keep in mind, is the one that it is a constant struggle, and that struggle requires allies. Finally, just to make my last point, which is about what can universities do? Because universities produce knowledge, and they also produce evidence that we can use in our movement and in our protests. If we look at universities and how diverse they are, I think it's a pretty sad picture. According to an research that came out in February of this year, in 2020, less than 1% of all professors in the UK, so we're talking full professors, not assistant professors or associate professors, full professors, of the 21,000 full professors, only 140 of them identified as Black. That's less than 1%. Why is this the case? And what can be done? I think it needs to start off with programs that support young Black students to go into academia. So support them financially, but also support them through pastoral care and mentoring. I think there need to be opportunities, more positions, for instance, on Black studies, which don't exist yet to the number and degree that they need to. And I think, we do also need to think about creating research funding for those professors to be able to publish, to be able to do the research, and to get tenure and to get promoted. I'm really proud to say that where I work, the International Inequalities Institute, we've now committed to 2 positions, a research officer on racial inequality, racial justice, and also a policy officer on racial equality and racial justice. And those will be advertised in 2021. So watch this space. But I think, these are things that we can all think about, at least academics can think about, and how we mobilize and try to get change. So I'll stop there, and I want to thank everyone who organized this.
Oh, thank you very much. Wow, I am indeed blown away by that. Look, can I firstly say thank you to our 3 speakers that have provided insight and enlightenment to this debate. I'm going to now pass you on to our co-chair, who we're going to alternate some of the questions that we've received. And I know there are some questions in the Q&A box. So I'm hoping we're able to answer them. And according to my watch, we've got, I see it's about 4:10. So we've got actually quite a good time. And for me, the best part of any debate is always the Q&A. So I'm really delighted that we've got some time for that. So I'll pass you over to my co-chair, Red, who will lead some of the questions.
Thanks, Donald. And yeah, to take you, wow, that's great. Thank you so much for those contributions. That's going to be a fantastic basis. I've already got questions that have come from everything that our 3 panelists have said, and we've got 5 questions in the Q&A. If you do have any more questions, please put them in. But let's just get started. And this is a question I'll put to everyone on the panel. Anyone who wants to pick it up can go with it. What's the point of protesting? And I know, Amina, you've touched on this briefly in what you've been saying, but why do we do it? How do we measure what's useful? Is it just about throwing banners around every once in a while? Is it a kind of purge? What is it? Why do we protest? Throw that out there to any of you.
So I'll start off, actually. I think, protesting really gives individuals the opportunity to express themselves and to show solitude to a cause that they may believe in. it's also that high visibility that protest presents. You know, if we look at some of the protests that have taken place this summer, for example, they've been attended by, you know, diverse crowds, and, you know, the Black Lives Matter, which was a mixture of Black, brown, white people in attendance. And it's also, you know, we look at some of the trans protests that took place. Again, you know, diverse crowds that participated in them. But I really think it's the opportunity for people to show their solidarity, to find a space to be linked with like-minded people, to discuss the issues, and to really, because most times there's such a frustration and anger that's built up before you even get to a protest. And you're thinking, how do I express myself? What do I do? How do I do it? You know, where do I find that safe space to do it amongst people like myself? And I think, you know, that's why people come out to protest. And I think it's also, you know, that belief that my message will be seen, my voice will be heard, whether or not I'm carrying a banner, whether or not I'm wearing a t-shirt, or whether or not I'm using some other symbol to get my message across. But I think it's the solidarity, the inner voice that creates that visible voice, of really wanting to be in the heart of the cause that you're supporting.
That's great. Chloe, is there anything that you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I you know, I would agree. It's like I said in my opening comments, it's, for the most part, it's about how we use our voices, how you find your voice, how you share your voice. You know, like I mentioned, I'm a parent, and I couldn't be at the Black Lives Matter protests, you know, the many that went on in the city in London, but I wanted to be. You know, I had that overwhelming need as a Black person to stand alongside other Black people at a time where we are so frightened, so scared, to show solidarity, but also to find community in each other, find support and strength in those spaces. You know, show up for people. For a lot of times, when you're protesting against something that isn't necessarily your lived experience, in particular, you know, Black Lives Matter movement, Pride, protests, you know, when you looked and you saw, you know, the scene outside the Brooklyn Museum, which is what Chris is talking about, which was the trans rally, where everybody wore white in solidarity for Black trans people and the, you know, disproportionate loss of life that's been going on. It was a moment to show solidarity and stand shoulder to shoulder and side by side, but also to find comfort as well. So, you know, ultimately, for me, I think protesting happens in so many different dynamics, but it truly really is about using your voice. Whether you put your voice on a placard and, you know, you put all your feelings out there, whether you are screaming in the streets and you are chanting, but we're all still using our voices in the hope that we will finally really be heard.
Yeah. And do you think then the measure of a successful protest, the outcome, is being heard by policymakers? Is it effective changes in legislation? Is it social media momentum? What is it that that we can say that was a successful campaign or a successful protest?
I think there's some, we all come into this with different ideas. Because for me, we can't measure it until it doesn't exist anymore. If we still have to keep going out to the streets to protest, then that in essence means there's something so fundamentally wrong. And until we change that part, then for me, that's what true success looks like. Because you know, there are some ways where our voices have been amplified at this particular time, because we can't not talk about the other things that happen. So we can't not talk about being in the middle of a pandemic and being in the middle of COVID still, which has actually given us that silence that has allowed the voices that have been going on during protesting to be so very loud, you know, in ways where we're not distracted by life and working and so many other things. and then also how we are holding people to account and each other, because I can guarantee you that the many protests that have been going on around the world, the knock-on from where people are truly being held to account, where things are ending up, you know, in front of policymakers for the very first time. This isn't new. We have been doing this for decades. We have been saying this for decades, but it's sometimes only in these periods where it's really having the spotlight, and also where it's not just us. You know, it's not just the responsibility of marginalized people to, we're tired to scream and shout. It is also other people alongside us who are amplifying that protest in their businesses, you know, who are holding people to account. You know, I'm sure if you didn't see what happened at Starbucks, then, you know, you can see that there have been so many businesses who've been in support of Black Lives Matter, but have then been held accountable when they haven't done that responsibly. They're only doing it to be seen to be doing the right thing. So yeah, when it's not necessary anymore, that's when it will truly be successful, because we would have reached a point in society where our voices truly do matter, where we are usualized in abundance across all structures, all hierarchies, and we don't keep having to shake the foundations anymore because we are part of society and usualized. Sorry, get off the box now.
No, that makes a great deal of sense, actually, and that's a really interesting point, that we can't. It's really hard to measure what successful protest is when you're in it, when you're in the throes of it. So if we just move on to the next slide, I had a little bit of a point that may have been of interest that maybe, I don't know, Chris or Amina could address. Slogans for protests. A bit light, but what do you think is the importance of slogans, and does it matter who comes up with them?
I can start again on that. I think, you know, slogans have been around, and protest banners have been around since the early 20th century. So, you know, they're well established and part of the protest movement. And if we look at the early days, they were often formulated and printed by the organizers of those protests. I think it was really in the early 60s that we saw that protest slogans moved into more of an individual statement. They were beginning to become personalized. Still commandeering that message that, you know, of the purpose of the protest. And if we look at the slide that we're looking at now, is really the slogans that were used from the first Pride in 1969, that Pride in London recreated for the 50th anniversary year before last in the celebrations. You know, they're all quite unique in their statements, but they all leading to a common theme of, you know, lifting this oppression against queer people and gay men and women. And I think what we have today is the slogans, some come quite serious, some can be punchy and funny, but again, it's about giving people the opportunity to express themselves, express that inner voice. And I think when we look at the slogans collectively, they create a mass piece of communication that goes out that can support the cause that we're actually protesting. So I think we're moved away from, you know, the concept of everyone carrying the same banner, but people are coming with the theme and the message, but putting their individual stamps and statement to it. I think it gives a bit of it gives a deeper ownership to what you're actually protesting and fighting for. And it really allows people to feel the cause, because what they've created, it's their message, it's their voice, and it's really about how they want to express themselves when they're out there protesting. So whether or not it's, you know, the slogan is on a banner, which most people will carry, but we're all now also seeing it on T-shirts, you know, everywhere. But I think slogans are an essential part of really communicating a message, a strong message, a powerful message that can be seen not just nationally and locally, but internationally as well.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Thanks so much. It's this way of like making your very personal voice heard and connecting internationally, nationally with everyone who's in the same fight. So I'm going to hand over to Donald now, and we will move quickly onto the next sort of bit of the pre-prepared questions we have, because we have a lot of questions coming into the Q&A. And hopefully he'll, is he there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just absorbed with it all. I'm going to take a couple more of these pre-agreed questions, and then I think
get into the Q&A.
We'll go to the Q&A. And I really want to touch on both what Chloe mentioned and indeed Armenia, in that partly about protest. So and it should protest. Is it always, because we relate, is it always where you need to have a whole collection of people, or is protest multifaceted? So is it a case of just me and I can do something, or is it we need to get everybody together and that's the only way we're going to be successful? We both touched on that.
I think that's a really good question, Donald. I think it can be both. You know, I think it can be the thousands of people gathering, right? Or it could be one person. And we all know now that, you know, I mean, the Arab Spring began with Mohammed Bouazizi setting himself alight. And that was an act of protest, a very powerful act of protest. And, you know, there are similar acts of, you know, individual protests. But I think, you know, here it's about tactics and strategies. What is going to work in this context, or what is not going to work in the context varies. And I think going back about, you know, this whole point of why do we protest? I think, you know, if we look at, as Chloe rightly pointed out, you know, it's not like we're talking about this today. We've been talking about these issues for decades, right? But sometimes the voices that policymakers hear are the voices of, you know, the professional and charities or NGOs who might not be shouting, right? Who might be speaking in a very nice tone, in a professional tone, but they're not taking them seriously. So when you have a more radical group who's going to, let's say, turn, you know, this is an actual protest, who colored the fountains in Trafalgar Square red to point out how austerity was costing people's lives, then they got on the news. Or when they disrupted a film screening and, you know, lay on the red carpet, then they got on the news. So I think, you know, protest is used as a tactical strategy when other forms of trying to get your point across are not heard. And I think, you know, it can work in different ways, but I, you know, someone had asked about violence in the questions. I think, you know, this is another question. Sometimes violence will bring you attention, but not the right kind. And of course, you know, there is a whole, I mean, that's another whole topic that I don't want to get into now, but I think, you know, this is something about really thinking about, you know, violence versus nonviolent movements and protests, and, you know, thinking around that as well. So yes, there can be large protests where you feel the joy of being around people who are also going through what you're going through, or sharing those values and those demands that you do, but it could also be very lonely and individual.
You know, I guess I'll pick up the lonely and individual, because, you know, sometimes, like I said, just being who you are is the protest, navigating through spaces that aren't necessarily designed for you, you know, for us. My reality is the world was not created for me. The world was not created for Black women to thrive. So sometimes as I've navigated through my career and I'm in, you know, the senior role that I'm in, it is very lonely. There aren't a lot of other people who look like me, or if there are, I can count on one hand, and even now I can count on a couple of hands. It's not in abundance. You know, we often hear the phrase, you cannot be what you do not see. And so sometimes the very protest is being that that example of you know, another Black and brown body, another Black queer body, another Black female queer body. You know, when I think about my role models, people that I'm fortunate enough to know that navigate in this space that I do, there aren't a lot of Black women, you know, and whilst there may be some wonderful prominent Black lesbians, there aren't also a lot of, you know, more than one hand Black bisexual women too. So when we look at the very different layers of identity that we have in our community and see where we are celebrated in these, you know, in these higher positions, I think, you know, for me, my protest very much so comes in my work. You know, it comes in doing what I do in my day job, and also inviting other people who look like me into that space, but being the person that can have those conversations with corporates, with organizations, to say, when you are doing this work, you know, what does it look like for other people that look like me? Where is your race network involved? Actually, what language you're using when you're talking about the different, you know, intersections? And do you actually know what the definition of intersectionality is? And it's not the new buzzword for diversity. And can we do this responsibly? And that's not to separate from being LGBT, because, you know, I am inclusive of all, and so when we talk about inclusion, it's making sure that we are talking about all parts of our identities. Because remember, I'm Black, but I'm also bisexual, I'm also a mother. So when I'm thinking about what does that look like in the workplace, you know, we could be having this conversation about women. You know, we could be having this conversation about where women in senior leadership are, and we would still be having this conversation for a long time, because whilst the dial has moved, it hasn't moved in the same abundance as, you know, in particular white men. So we have to kind of have all of those multiple conversations that are going on at the same time, you know, because sometimes the protest also is at the detriment to ourselves. I know there have been times where I have wanted to lend my voice to something because it has felt so important, and actually recognize that that is also not safe for me, because it's bringing your voice into a space that might not necessarily do that responsibly. And so you also have to think about, you know, for instance, when you're doing, you know, a panel, as we are now in Black History Month, and you think about, okay, well, where is the representation on a panel? And if there aren't, you know, other faces who look like mine, should this really be something that I should be involved in? And so the protest sometimes is also stepping down and saying, actually, this isn't for me, but also I think that in shaping this event for the future, these are my recommendations. I can suggest some other speakers. And so that's not violent. That's still a protest. We use what we have to disrupt. And so I guess that maybe for me is more hand in hand of protest is also the disruption. And we can disrupt in so many different ways by using what we have to, you know, shape the foundations of change. Because ultimately a protest is saying that you disapprove of something, that you see that something is wrong. And then there is an action alongside that. And I think we as individuals, we all choose and determine what those actions are. I know that there's a lot of questions about the violence.
Yeah, we're going to come to those questions.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure we get to this, but I just wanted to point out that it's also based on what we know or are told, because a lot of times all media does is focus on the violence.
Yeah.
But you're forgetting that, you know, even as I said to you earlier, Nigeria's had so many days of peaceful protest, so many days where thousands upon thousands of people have stood calmly to protest. And it's only when violence is put upon them, you know, we focused in Black Lives Matter and where there was violence in the Black Lives Matter movement, forgetting there were protests day after day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day in different parts of our country that were entirely peaceful. So we also have to question, when we talk about protest, do we actually have all of our information for what the ethos of that protest really was before we then focus on the violence?
Right. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to start looking at the Q&A. So I've taken over Red's slot, but just one question, and then Red will come in. Is the first questions that was set by Amanda Machin. Hope I've pronounced Amanda's name correctly. And it's partly what you said, Chloe, and Armenia. I'd like to get your comments on this, because you said something which is interesting, because you mentioned that with the austerity protest or marches, very few people of color was present. And perhaps we all know the statistics in terms of poverty within the BAME community. And so it would have been a case there that they would have been hand in hand involved in that protest, wouldn't they? And it may be something that, as Chloe says, I can't lend myself to that protest. And I don't know if that's the right space for me, because it's really interesting, isn't it? That Pride and Black Lives Matter, the interconnection between the two as such. But why, and the question relates to not just around, austerity, but the question really relates to other social movements like climate protests. So I wonder if you could answer that for me, please.
I'll take that. I think, it's very important to create alliances across movements. And I think within the anti-austerity movement, the wider, there were attempts to create alliances, like Disabled People Against Cuts started to work with, other groups that were not focused on disability issues, but were still had a shared interest around austerity. I think it is about finding that shared interest, but there's also always going to be areas where you disagree. And those areas might be small. And so movements might overlook them and say, fine, but they might become very contentious issues where alliances can fall apart. So I think, we need to think really carefully, as Chloe was saying, who do you ally with, and who, where do you stop an alliance when, are they coming out and saying something that's really objectionable to your core principles and values as a movement? And I think this is where, it's been, the climate movement has been very, I think, slow in gaining the support of people of color, because they haven't recognized that some of their tactics, some of their approaches have not taken into account people's lived experiences. Asking for people to get arrested ignores the fact that more people of color face violence from the police, from the judicial justice system. Asking people to block the roads and all of this. So I think, to me, we have to unpack that and really think carefully. I mean, I've seen movements who come together and then fall apart because they couldn't agree on core principles. And I think as a movement, if you are committed to those core principles, it will be not, it won't be easy. But, that's just my perspective.
No, thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that, because I've often heard the point made about the climate protests, and it may have been unfair that it seems, and I don't think so, but the media has classified it as a middle class movement. But that might be unfair. But I wonder if Chloe or Christopher, you've got any comments around that.
I think, when we look at I would say the intersectionality of protest, it's always quite interesting as to what people actually choose to support. And, for us at Pride in London, we have very much associated ourselves with climate protests. But if I can refer to sort of the Black Trans Lives Matter protests that we had during the summer, which was very well attended. However, the majority of participants for that protest was, predominantly from the white community. So we didn't see that crossover of Black members of the community coming to support that, which is particularly discouraging considering when we look back at the history of protest and how Black trans women have fought and led us through movements, but yet Black Lives Matter, sometimes they forget that, Black trans women are part, and men, and non-binary are part of the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's an interesting view. it's one that, you know, myself, I'm trying to understand how people choose what causes they want to support and when they want to support. But you know, for us, we align ourselves to a lot of the other protests that do exist, because all of us as volunteers and participants in the Pride organizations all have different views, but we bring them to the table, and sorry, we're trying to align our values with those that those protests that are actually happening outside of Pride.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in my other co-chair who will continue, hopefully, addressing some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A. Red.
Thank you very much, Donald. This is a fantastic chat. We're getting some really excellent questions in, and I think some of them have been addressed together. I want to explore a little bit further with all of you this concept of the intersections of protest and how we get everybody on board in fighting for sort of everyone's shared best interests. It can be a real challenge when we've talked about the climate protests, we've talked about you know, trans women particularly, but indeed trans people in Black Lives Matter, and also women's marches, which we've not touched on so much, but how we incorporate the voices of Black people or the most marginalized voices effectively. I mean, Amina, you kind of touched on this with the Nancy Fraser quote you gave, but how do we do it? Are we just set to go round in circles with sort of no one showing solidarity, or there needs to be a quid pro quo, or what's the solution to getting effective solidarity across different movements? I don't know if Amina, you want to take that, start us off.
Yeah, effective solidarity across movements. I think, you know, it has to be also genuine solidarity, right? Not just in words. And I think what we've seen, at least, you know, when I was looking at the US, when Black Lives Matter, you know, this past few months, there was a lot of kind of outpouring of support, but how much of it was on the surface and how much of it was really genuine, right? And I think, for instance, you know, it's easy to kind of put a slogan and sell a t-shirt. It's much more difficult to say, right, you know, I'm going to change my hiring practices. I am going to change the way I promote and, you know, support people's advancement. And none of that was touched upon, right? So it becomes this kind of performativity, a performative action that makes you feel good. So I think, you know, here we need to also think around what is real solidarity. It's so easy now on social media to hashtag me too, blah, blah, you know, but it's like, what does it really mean to be in solidarity? And I think this is where I would shift the responsibility on those in power, those in businesses, and say, right, okay, you've now, you know, sold this t-shirt or whatever you've done, right? Or I think in Pride Month, Pret has those granola bars that they wrap in the rainbow flag. But what have you actually done? What kind of changes have you made to your company's policy? So that's how I want to think about it. But I don't know what others think.
I'm applauding you. I mean, like, roll with it. Hi. Like, I mean, we've got 19 minutes and we could start a whole nother segment on performative allyship. Like, seriously, you know, and don't get me started on the black square, which got the meaning, the actual true heart and the meaning of it got taken away and replaced with something else. And I think, you know, Chris, you just said this, like, we can't talk about Black Lives Matter and not talk about Black LGBTQ lives. And also that our movement started with Black trans, Black queer people, but quickly that got erased by, you know, the white LGBTQ community who, you know, created their own movement on the back of that. And so often, like Chris said at the beginning, everyone will always say Marsha P. Johnson, but they also will not say Stormy and Sylvia Rivera. So, you know, they're names that were there at the very beginning, and they so often get erased. I think, you know, from my perspective, I right now, I'm not gonna lie, I really enjoy having those conversations. I mean, what are you actually doing in the workplace, and not playing lip service to it? You know, when we're having those meetings about how can we better make sure that the work that you do is truly intersectional for all identities, but if particularly you're going to talk about Black LGBTQ+ people, then there is so much nuance. That's my word. There is so much nuance, and if you don't understand, you know, in truly understanding what it means to talk about intersectionality and the different barriers of oppression that stop people from participating, and how people cannot bring all parts of their identities, and how are you thinking about that in your business at all levels? So, like I said, how are you not thinking about, right, okay, so what does your boardroom look like for Black and brown bodies of all genders, all identities? What does that also look like if I take myself, for example? So I need a flexible working contract because I got kids. So, you know, I need somewhere that has an amazing well-being program because on Tuesdays I have therapy at 12 o'clock. If you are not mindful of people's well-being, especially at this time, then your business is not truly going to be as productive as it possibly can be. So if you don't understand all the different barriers that will stop your employees of being able to show up for you, which therefore is going to affect your bottom line, you're really not serious. And we now can't keep talking about how serious you really are just by, you know, a flag. We already talk about pink washing, you know, at the moment, this whole Black Lives Matter and, you know, the blackwashing that has come from this, of other people getting on board saying, oh my God, we really do support Black lives, until the Black lives in your business say, wait, so how? Like, I've been here for a while. Can you explain? And have been holding people to account. So yeah, if your intentions are not good, that will get found out. And now we're at a point where those hard questions are really needing to be asked, but they really need to be asked now from your peers. So actually, you know, from a CEO to another CEO, of actually having that uncomfortable and hard conversation. You know, I did a training session. I head up our LGBT 101 session, and I remember I had someone that said, oh my God, you know, like, because we expand the spectrum, we talk about the different identities that live within it at all times, but you probably only know LGBT or LGBT+. And he said, oh, there's so many different letters. It's so, you know, so hard for me to get. And I was like, well, we've been here the whole time. I said, I'll make it a bit simpler for you. What are you doing for Black and brown people who look like me? Forget that I'm LGBT for a minute. What are you doing? So this isn't, you know, this isn't the first rodeo of actually how do we show up for other people. Like I said to you, we're still doing this for women. You talked about Women's March, Women's Movement. Yes, it might have been 101 years, but we are still struggling to be able to show up in spaces where we are entitled to be. So if you don't understand that all of these movements are going on in parallel, and therefore you need to know the nuance of how you bring them all together, but that can only happen through communication and collaboration. If you're not all speaking to each other, then all movements will continue to be in silo, and we will keep repeating the things that have happened. The only real difference and change that we're seeing is now people are coming together and showing up together for each other. You know, it's in raising our voices for each other's struggles, and actually saying, I'm going to use my platform to shine a light on your struggle, because I know that it's the important and right thing to do. I'm grateful for the connections that I have, and you know, I one of our volunteers at UK Pride is Anik, and Anik, who is, you know, my amazing friend, but I've learned so much about the intersex community from listening and from taking his wisdom and understanding. I'm not intersex, but can I now raise my voice responsibly for the intersex community because I have someone who has shared the information that I know needs to go to my space? Absolutely. And if we don't continue to keep building those connections and sharing each other's stories, we'll keep coming and finding ourselves back in these spaces.
Absolutely, thank you so much. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Chris, but just perhaps you could also speak to a little bit more this concept of you know, we've talked about we need to not erase the essential aspects of history. You know, it's not like trans people, LGBTQ people never existed, or Black people didn't have an impact in women's struggles historically, things like that. And accountability of the powers to the powers that be, you know, the heads of those corporations, and leadership and cross communication between them and holding each other accountable. But I'm really interested in this idea of whose responsibility is it? When we get to a difficult point in our shared struggles, when there's a difficulty in communicating the issues for LGBTQ plus people, for example, for someone who is heterosexual, cisgendered, how do we really navigate those things? Because I think more often than not, it's now we're seeing more and more of these tensions that, you know, you'll see people who are classically were anti-austerity and very much on the left, who just do not have the patience for a discussion about someone's identities, and they might be a white man who has suffered terribly under austerity, and I think those are the places where I think we really do struggle, and they're very difficult to navigate. And I wondered if anybody could offer some solutions around that. I don't know if Chris, you wanted to weigh in, or?
Yeah, I think it's about, you know, understanding those Black, brown people, minority ethnic people, and the cultures that actually sit around them. Coming into our spaces and understanding, often you find that, you know, Black and brown people get erased from the table because there's just a total bias. There's that misunderstanding. There's that lack of awareness. They feel that there's going to be a disruption to their safe spaces, when in fact we probably can add value to their space, to their organizations, to their businesses. And no matter how far down the you know, the poll that you may find some white people, they may be low and down, but they're still not willing to accept us as Black and brown people who may be at the same level as them, you know, from an economic perspective, from a job perspective. So it's really about, you know, when we talk about organizations and businesses, about those leaders really looking at what they're doing to elevate our voices and bring prosperity to Black and brown people. You know, as Chloe said, looking at your exec team, looking at your trustees in your organizations. What are you actually doing to make change there? You know, the summer of 2020 has really shone light on so many different organizations and so many different things in businesses where people are trying to hold themselves to account. But in many instances, they're also wanting us as Black and brown people to do the work, which, you know, we shouldn't have to come and do the work, but we've been in oppression for so many years. And here we are coming to now, you know, it's almost like coming to pick the cotton again.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. Right, I'm aware we've only got, oh, Amina, were you gonna?
Yeah, I was.
You muted yourself.
I think, Chris, you made a really important point, and you know, it's about whose responsibility is it, right? And I think Audrey Lorde touched upon that, where she critiqued, you know, it's the Black and third world people. I mean, that's a phrase from the past, but are expected to educate white people. It's lesbian and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual, and it creates this labor and this responsibility. And I think, you know, again, even in progressive movements, someone had asked a question about feminist movement. Even that movement has needed to be, you know, challenged in terms of its own kind of racism, let's call it what it is, right? And the fact that it isn't taking into account the different perspectives and positionalities, and has to be called out. And I think that's why I always think, you know, any movement is not from point A to point B. It's a constant process of having to challenge and to think, and, you know, so I think, but that's a whole bigger discussion. So I'll end there.
Thanks so much. Now I'm just gonna hand over to Donald to continue perhaps answering some more of these Q&A questions, but there's one very topical question that I just wanted to put out there to get people's thoughts on, and this was the Equalities Minister today. And so we've got, this has come from Genevieve Timmins, who said she was wondering your thoughts on the comments by Kemi Badenoch about the critical race theory and the way in which she characterized Black Lives Matter and protests like this. And I suppose this kind of feeds into a bit of a wider conversation, your thoughts on what's the role of politicians and politics today and their attitudes to movements. You know, is this something we should be worried about?
I guess I'll keep it really short because my personal opinions, I don't think I should truly voice in this space because it's a lot. What I will say though, and I'm going to come at this from a parent's perspective. So if my children will be taught in school about colonialism, they will be taught about Marxism, they will be taught about other people's history where civil liberties were brought into account, and they are not taught about Black history, or they are discouraged from, you know, talking about this current times, then I'm sorry, but your viewpoint really has no standing, because that is British history. My children are going to be taught about the oppression of Black people. And so if you're going to erase all of that, then we can have another discussion. But if this is still current curriculum and part of current curriculum, then I'm sorry, you have no time and space to be saying what you have said today. You have no grounds. Go back and look at that first before you then weigh up where you are, because the reality comes back to what I said. You are uncomfortable. Welcome to being Black. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm sorry for you. I can't erase that I am Black. But if you are not going to focus on my lived experience and try and change it because it makes you uncomfortable, and yet I had no choice and no say in learning about British history, British colonialism that oppressed where I come from, and I was born here, I don't think we have an argument. I think you are just talking beyond your measure, and the fact that it was done via a Black voice, so it was supposed to be landed a bit more palatably. We've seen it, we saw it, we will still continue to keep doing what we're doing.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm looking at the questions, and there's a question which was about anonymous, and I think we touched on this, and it was how can, and this question was from a white heterosexual male, how can they, and it's about allyship, how can they support such movements, Pride, Black Lives Matter, etc. As you guys mentioned, the onus should not be on Black people. It should be on allies or providing their support. How do they go about doing that?
I think that's a quite easy win. I think it's about becoming an ally. It's about looking at those Black organizations where perhaps you can volunteer your time and experience. And the third thing is it's also about funding those organizations to ensure that their programs remain in support of the community. Three easy things to really become, a supporter of the movement.
Anyone else want to comment on that, or we can move on to another question?
I just say maybe it's about listening rather than assuming you know, and I think I'm here to listen and learn as well.
Yeah.
It's ultimately not just learning to be uncomfortable. We're all uncomfortable, but that's really where true change happens. So, don't try not to center yourself and take it personally, and also just accept that people are really sharing their experiences and they're being vulnerable, and that is demanding of respect when people are coming to you and telling you where they are really hoping for a change to be done, and that you can use your privilege and your platform to try and do that, whether that be leaders, whether that be community groups or whomever, but really listen, and listen to hear, don't listen to respond, because that's true allyship. And also not always wanting a pat on the back for it. If you are a true ally, that doesn't require reward, and that should be something that you do every single day.
Okay, this will have to be the last question, because I know the time is only a couple of minutes to 5. But so I want each of you, the panelists, to just give a quick response. And this related to, and I think we touched on this, and it was about, this is from Keith Fraser. He would like to ask about, are there examples of approaches to creating a broad, inclusive intersection movement, which might involve people who disagree strongly on some things? So is there an opportunity for such a group to exist? And if so, what are the ingredients? I really know that's a long question, and I don't know if you've got time to answer that.
Yeah, I can start off here. I think from an organizational perspective, I can give Pride as an example. So we recognize that, Pride is a protest, and we recognize that everyone has the right to protest. So for us as an organization, on the actual day, we actually provide space for those who wish to counter-protest against Pride. So we have a space for, I think we have many years, we've had a Christian group that have come out to do counter-protest. So they are there present throughout the whole event, throughout the whole parade. Their voice is often drowned out by the 35,000 people that are protesting, but we do recognize that they have that voice to protest, and we do provide them that space.
Anyone else would like to comment?
I'll just share an example of a group that tried to do intersectional organizing. It's Sisters Uncut, and I think their approach is really to create the spaces where decisions are made and where things are discussed. And in a way, I think, as Chloe was saying, without centering yourself, without people getting hurt, kind of feeling, oh, this is all about me. It's not easy, because people do get hurt and people feel like, oh my God, you've made me feel so uncomfortable. But I think it's about having those spaces and being committed to that. Now that means that you have a longer time in organizing, because you're going to have to discuss everything, and you're going to give people time to share and think. But I think, change doesn't happen unless you change your own practices. Change isn't only about out there, it's about being the change we want to see in the world. That's what I think. You have to practice.
Yeah, I think it's understanding that, there are some safe spaces that are necessary for more marginalized groups. It's about understanding, but ultimately, it's like I said, if we're not collaborating together positively for true change and talking to each other, then we're never actually going to fully get there. So that is part and parcel of recognizing that not every space is for you, should be taken up by you, and learning when to give up your space. I think that's the real issue now, is that more people, myself included, it's not always my turn to speak, and I can recognize that. I think that if we can all internally do that work, businesses even more so, in giving up space, in making sure they're paying marginalized speakers to share their voice on their platforms, because that is also giving them something. Recognizing that across all movements, particularly Black LGBTQ+ people, that's really where the true work will cement for the future. But yeah, we have to keep speaking openly to each other and recognizing that there is space for everyone. We just need to understand each other's lived experience, and that takes time.
Well, thank you, Chloe. I think that's a fitting end to today's proceedings. I'm going to let Red close. She doesn't know. She knows it now. She doesn't know it then. But I just want to say personally, a real thank you. I think one of you, or maybe all of you, said something about learning. and listening to stories and being aware. And I'm really grateful to actually hear your stories. I've definitely learned today, and I hope many others have. And it's about having that conversation. So from my perspective, I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd also like to thank the organizers, Imperial 600, LGBTQ+, and the other staff network for putting this on. So I'll leave the closing points and remarks to Red.
Thanks, Donald. Yeah, I enjoy when that's sprung on me, but I think it really has been a really great collaboration we've had here and really successful. It's been really good hearing your different perspectives and takes, looking at, you know, the theories behind how we campaign, how we protest, and the practicalities and the challenges we have today in trying to do that effectively across different identities and for different courses that we're working in. I think we've learned a lot about the fact that this is going to be a process of personal reflection and listening and thinking and continuing to talk through the things that we find most challenging in order to make really effective changes. So I don't think there's anything to be said about, rather than thank you so much to our panelists who were truly fantastic. It's been a real pleasure for me, and I'm sure Donald will say the same. And thanks to everyone in both staff networks at Imperial College and at the London School of Economics for helping bring this together.
No, thank you. And I believe that this has been recorded. And I believe after editing, this will become available. I'm not sure on what platform, perhaps the organizers can inform us, but I believe all participants will be sent a link, at least they can record. So yeah, can I thank everyone, you know, for participating, for taking the time to listen to these amazing speakers. And it is a case of, you know, us growing together and learning and understanding. So thank you very much. You know, really take care, everyone. Stay safe and stay well. And
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a
Bye.
nice evening. Stay safe.
It's great. Bye.